Hello everyone and welcome to this, our first webinar as part of Feed Fact Fortnight, our autumn edition. Tonight we're talking about a topic that I know will be close to everyone's hearts, not just winter woes but also feeding. So tonight's topic is smart feeding when forage is scarce, which a lot of us know all about, and quality is variable. We're very lucky to be joined this evening by three of our leading equine nutritionists in the country. I'm joined by Dr. Katie Williams, who's Technical and Product Development Manager for Dengie. Also delighted to be joined by Olivia Colton, who is the Quality Manager for Fox Feeds. And last but certainly not least, Kate Hore, who is the Head Nutritionist for NAF. We are going to start with Katie talking about the fundamentals of forage. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Claire. So, evening everyone. I think my job really is to try and set the scene a little bit and cover some sort of core principles really. And I think everyone's talking about forage, or certainly has been for the last few weeks. Because of the lack of moisture that we've had over the summer, yields are down. So I think concerns are twofold really. Running out of forage is a very hot topic in the southeast of England, where our yields were really, really down. But also I think because there's an increased demand, it's obviously pushing prices up across the country. So whichever sort of area of the country you're in, whether you have a shortfall or whether you're just seeing prices increasing, you've probably got these issues floating around in your head at the moment. So what we're going to try and do is cover off some, I suppose, key points to help you reduce waste, make sure you're feeding enough but not too much, and then certainly things you can do to ensure that you're making your forage go further as well, and balancing all of that, which is obviously where Kate will come in. So I'm going to try and set the scene a little bit. So as I mentioned, reducing waste obviously is a good thing generally, but even more so when you've got a scarcity problem, and it does help you to manage your costs as well. So when we're thinking about forage, when we're storing it, we've really got to either keep the moisture out if it's hay, so there's no plastic wrap around it, it's exposed to the environment, and one of the ways we preserve or conserve that forage is by keeping it dry. We've taken the moisture out in the harvesting process, and then when we store it, we've got to keep it dry so it doesn't start to deteriorate. So making sure you've got no leaky roofs and it's well and truly at the back of the shed, away from the open door where water might come into the store. All those sort of very practical things that you can do to try and reduce waste. If you've got wrapped forages, and obviously Olivia is going to talk a lot more about making haylage and the importance of keeping it airtight, but what we're trying to do there, and when it's in the store, is also make sure we're not accidentally puncturing those bags and allowing air in, because that's going to again result in deterioration. So some really basic things, but you'd be surprised how many yards you go on where you see forage potentially being wasted because it's either been exposed to moisture or air. The other key point really is trying to sort of monitor how much forage your horse is consuming. So it's important that we weigh what we're putting in and what's left over, if there is any, if you haven't got the sort of greedy pony that gobbles the lot up, because we can again reduce waste that way. And I think historically we've kind of fallen into the trap, I suppose, of just saying feed ad lib. Okay, that's great. We know our horses have got access to lots of forage, but true ad lib means that your horse would always have something available to it. And there comes a point where you'd actually have to remove that sort of waste forage that they haven't eaten. And actually in the modern sort of way of thinking, that is quite wasteful. So we need to again perhaps consider or reframe what we're when we're talking about feeding forage, maybe it's feeding to appetite rather than ad lib. So we're feeding enough but not too much. So those are some basic things to sort of think about when we're working out what type of forage we're going to use, where we're going to store it, and how much we're actually going to feed. So my slides will move on. How much forage can a horse actually eat? Well, we all know, if we've had horses for a while, that they're very much individuals. They all have their own characters, and that certainly is reflected in their appetite as well. So some horses are going to consume much more than others, and typically we work to an upper appetite of around 2.5% of body weight. Now, I think it's very important to stress that horses, and particularly ponies, never read the rule books. So there have been studies where they've been recorded consuming up to 5% in dry matter of their body weight. So that 2.5% sort of upper limit is very much a theoretical one, and you have to be sort of mindful that they could actually consume quite a bit more. Clearly, they don't necessarily need to do that, and if it's contributing to being overweight or putting on excessive weight, then we need to limit their intake. And again, that's another reason why we probably don't want to be feeding ad lib anymore. It's just feeding enough, but not too much. And again, one of the sort of key principles we need to keep in mind, and this is going to be expanded on by Olivia when we're looking at things like haylage and wrapped forages, how dry are the forages that we're feeding to a horse? And that matters because it allows us to ensure we're meeting their minimum fibre intake. And if we're using very wet forages, then there's a lot of water that the horse is consuming. So it allows us to ensure that we're meeting a horse's minimum requirements, but also that we're comparing like with like if we do so on a dry matter basis rather than an as fed basis. So in the bar chart, you can see the blue bit is the water content and the yellow represents the dry matter. So if we take fresh pasture or grass, then it's around about 20% dry matter, 80% water. And these sort of numbers are rounded really, but as a guide. So most of what the horse is eating, in fact, the vast majority of what they're actually eating when they eat grass is actually water. So then if we dry the forage and we cut it to try and conserve it to make hay or haylage, we're reducing the water content and allowing the dry matter content to be a greater proportion of what the horse is consuming. So typically something like a haylage would be around 60% dry matter, 40% water, and then hay is obviously a lot drier at around 85% dry matter and just 15% water. So you can see how grass and hay were almost the exact opposite. And it's one of the reasons at this time of year when people are changing from predominantly grass-based rations over the summer to perhaps conserve forages for the winter, that it's an increased risk or a time of increased risk for things like colic, because we're fundamentally shifting the amount of water the horse consuming. We're giving them more indigestible fibre because we've conserved that forage. So they're taking in less water and more indigestible fibre, and unfortunately that increases the risk of colic. So all of these things are important to keep in mind, and just the differences in the fibre types that we're actually giving our horses. So what does that mean when we're thinking about as fed? Well, you can see there in the table that grass, because it's only 20% dry matter, to actually get that minimum amount of fibre that we need the horse to consume for general health and sort of well-being, we're talking about 37.5 kilos. So that's nearly 2 full bags of feed in equivalent terms to actually get the dry matter they need. So that's because so much of what they're actually eating is water. And then as the dry matter increases and the water content comes down, then obviously the amount they need to eat on an as fed basis is reducing. So because hay is so dry and there's obviously much more dry matter in it, then we're talking about 8.8 kilos, so less than half a bag of feed equivalent, to try and give you some perspective in terms of the total amount they need to eat. So it's really important we allow for the fact that there's a lot of water in certain forages, otherwise we could significantly underfeed the amount of fibre that they actually require. So that's important when we look at things like the wrapped forage in more detail in a minute. So what are the minimum forage recommendations? And really we're talking minimums when we're trying to manage a horse's weight. So if they're overweight or good doers typically put on weight very easily, these are the sorts of horses where we really want to limit the amount of forage and keep it as low as possible, but whilst ensuring we've got enough going in. So we tend to work on 1.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis. So that would be something like 7.5 kilos for a 500 kilo horse of dry matter that we actually need. Now, because hay still has some moisture in it, as fed, that actually means 8.8 kilos. So that's the minimum amount of hay that we would be wanting to ensure that the horse is getting enough to, in theory, maintain its health. And so if you've got a good doer, you can go as low as that. Some vets and nutritionists will go lower if they need to, because the horse's weight has plateaued and they're really trying to promote some weight loss. But you should always view doing that as a short-term strategy, so up to 3 months, and then whenever you can, you should be trying to return to that minimum of 1.5% of body weight on a dry matter basis. So when we know the sort of minimum that we've got to achieve, there's lots of different ways to get there, but we have to think about what the sort of benefits of, if we can get to that and potentially feed a bit more, what sort of benefits is it having for the horse's digestive system and their general health and well-being. So the main reason we're putting fibre and forages into the horse is to try and replicate what their sort of natural feeding strategy would be, so to eat lots of low nutritional value forage for long periods of time. So in the natural environment, they're eating for 16 to 18 hours of every day. So we're trying to replicate that. We want them to be eating for as long as we possibly can. So that means that they're chewing more, and we know that the horse produces more saliva as it chews, and that's going to help support potential buffering of acid further down the digestive system, and that helps reduce the risk of various diseases, but certainly things like squamous ulcers in the horse's stomach. It's also fibre that feeds all the beneficial bugs that live within the digestive system. And again, we're understanding much more about how those bugs have important roles and functions for other things like health, behaviour, well-being, etc. So it's really important we keep a healthy population of bugs. It's much harder to define what a healthy population of bugs actually is, because it's very, again, something that's very individual to a horse. But the basic principle is the more sort of fibre-based feeds you give, the more sort of beneficial good bugs you're likely to have in the digestive system. So it's really important for all of these reasons, as you know, particularly the horse's welfare as well. We want to replicate that natural sort of behaviour of eating for long periods of time, as well as the health of the digestive tract and the bugs that live within it. And these are the different options we have for sort of conserved forages in a long stem format. So we typically think of haylage as a sort of between 50 to 70% dry matter. Increasingly, and I'm sure Olivia's going to touch on this, we're seeing perhaps nutritionally what would be better described as a wrapped grass hay. So in other words, it's wrapped in plastic, but actually the dry matter is 70% plus, so closer to something like a hay, because there isn't enough moisture to achieve some fermentation. So nutritionally, it actually looks on paper, you know, when you do an analysis, much more like a hay. And then increasingly we have cereal straw, which I'm a real proponent for. It does divide opinion, but I think as a strategy for trying to manage the good doer, the horse that might be insulin dysregulated for PPID or EMS sort of reasons, where we're really trying to get the amount of sugar that they're consuming as low as possible, then straw actually really comes into its own, and you'll see in a minute that it's practical, it's useful, and it's great value as well. So at the moment, with forage prices going up and a lot of good doers in our equine population, then cereal straw is a really useful tool in our box to try and tackle both of those issues really. But you can see from the sort of arrow at the bottom, then things like haylage tend to be more digestible. They're cut typically earlier, although Olivia will, I'm sure, expand on that because they're probably harvesting throughout the year. But generally speaking, you're taking your wrap forages a little bit sooner than you would your hays. So they tend to be more digestible. And in my experience, they tend to be often quite a bit more palatable as well, certainly compared to things like straw at the other end of the spectrum. Unfortunately, the things that tend to be good for horses are the ones that are the least palatable. So it can be a bit of a challenge to get them to eat some of that cereal straw if we're not putting other things with it to make it a bit more palatable. And then just moving on to what we would want to use as sort of forage replacers. So if we are really short of forage, if you can't source any sort of cereal straw or bought in products, then we can look at some of the short chops, the pellets and mashes and things that can be part of the forage ration. what we have to bear in mind with those is that they're made up of different ingredients, and it's the combinations of those different ingredients that make them suitable or otherwise for using as a forage replacer. And often it's the digestibility and therefore the energy they provide that determine whether they're suitable or not. Because if they're too conditioning, too nutritious, then you're really limited on how much of them you want to feed for, say, a longer term strategy. So as a general principle, the plants that are the most mature and sort of lignified, to use a technical term, are the ones that are least digestible. So they're going to give the horse less energy, and therefore actually can make the most useful forage replacers, because we want lots of chew time for not many calories for most of our leisure horses and ponies. So we need those sort of taller, sort of more lignified fibre sources. And I think the next slide sort of demonstrates that. So on the right of the slide, so this sort of sugar beet pulp that you can see in the picture, sugar beet grows underground, so therefore it doesn't need very much structure to support itself because it's got the soil all around it. So it's what we call a highly digestible fibre source, a super fibre really, in that it's broken down very easily because it's not very lignified. So it can be a useful sort of partial contributor to the horse's forage requirements, but it's not going to be something we would use in its entirety as a sole forage replacer, because it's just probably going to be too high in calories for the vast majority of horses and ponies. So we tend to look to things like straw and some of the grass-based forages that might be chopped or they might be pelleted, to use them as sort of top-ups when our hay or haylage supplies are short. And then you've also got things like alfalfa, again quite nutritious. There's other things about it that you wouldn't use it as a complete sort of sole forage replacer, but as a blend mixed in with other ingredients, then it's very useful. The thing I would always say about the grass-based forages is that they are the ones that are going to be highest in sugar. So all the other ingredients, so in sugar beet pulp, the sugar's actually been removed, so we're left with the fibrous pulp. In straw, the sugar's been turned into the cereal grain, which is in the form of starch, so you don't have much sugar in the sort of stem or the stalk that we are using in animal feeds. And lucerne or alfalfa puts any surplus sugar in the form of starch into its roots and bits below ground that we don't then harvest for animal feed. So again, naturally very low in sugar. So you just need to bear those in mind if you have a horse that requires a low sugar ration. Then obviously we're going to dilute any sort of grass-based ones with things like straw and other ingredients to bring that sugar intake down. So yes, if you were going to use pure alfalfa, we would recommend up to 3 kilos per day. I mean, it is fed as a hay around the world in much larger amounts, but there are certain challenges associated with that. If you're blending things with straw, whether it's grass, alfalfa, then you can use them as complete forage replacers, because that normally brings the energy value down, so they're appropriate to use in larger amounts. And we tend to say with pellets and mashes, and you can certainly soak pellets to make them into a softer fibre feed, then they're great in that form as a partial contribution to the forage requirement. The exception being if you have a horse obviously with poor dentition, either through being old or if they've got diastemas, which are the abnormal gaps between teeth, and you need something that they can chew, then yes, you can certainly use things like pellets and mashes as a total forage if you have to. But it's because they're so easy to chew, then they don't have that same benefit of more chew time like a chopped fibre or a long length fibre would. So you just have to bear those things in mind. And this recent paper by Simon Daniels and colleagues from the RBC was really interesting. They actually looked at different ingredients and found that those that had less or required less chewing and therefore less time eating seemed to produce less saliva, and they measured that by the acidity level in the horse's mouth. And it wasn't a level that was going to cause a problem in terms of dental health and hygiene and tooth decay or anything like that, but it just made the point that actually these mashes that have water added, they're very easy to sort of for the horse to chew, don't require a lot of effort, are definitely correlated with less saliva being produced, and that will have potential repercussions further down the digestive system. So just thought that was an interesting one to share. I mentioned straw because I am a proponent for it, simply because we find it increasingly hard to find low sugar grass-based forages, and these long hot dry summers are definitely returning sort of grass-based forages that are much higher in sugar, because you've got lots of sun, plants are photosynthesizing, and the grass is accumulating sugar. So it's going to be increasingly hard to get these levels down to the sort of 10-12% that is being recommended if you've got a horse that's had laminitis, etc. So that's why I like straw. There's a lot of myth and misinformation around it, but it does allow you to feed more, give the horse more chew time for less calories. And there have been some follow-up studies to show that up to 50% of the forage ration being fed as straw is acceptable. It doesn't increase the risk of ulcers. So as long as you introduce it gradually and you haven't got a history of impaction colic or horses with poor dentition, then there's no reason that it can't be a really useful ingredient for those good doers. And in this study, it actually slowed the rate of eating so significantly that the insulinemic response, so that kind of response that the horse has to eating something, was so negligible, and you couldn't really even sort of register it. And if you've got an insulin dysregulated horse through EMS or PPID, that's really significant and very useful. So that's why I'm a real proponent for straw feeding if the situation is right. And just to round off, I wanted to sort of set the scene for Kate's slides as well. If we are starting to use these poorer quality forages, or intentionally or otherwise, if that's all we've got, because that's what's provided or we've grown ourselves, and this slide here just shows you what happens if you don't sort of supplement an average UK meadow hay. You're missing out on some of those key vitamins and minerals, so vitamin E in particular, copper, zinc and selenium, which we're naturally deficient in, and also the essential amino acid lysine, which you need for sort of helping to build and repair muscles. So that's just with hay. But if we intentionally go and include straw, because again, it's that poorer quality in terms of nutritional value, which we want if we're managing good doers. We want that energy level to be way down if we're going to actually achieve some weight loss. But again, we really start to lose those valuable vitamins and minerals. So it's really important that we balance the ration. And obviously Kate's going to talk a lot more about that in a minute. So I think that's me setting the scene, and I'm just going to scroll through the slides for Olivia. So over to you, Olivia. Just give me the nod when you want me to progress it.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Katie. So I was going to start by just going really quickly through how we make haylage. I think it might be quite useful to everyone to know, because there's different challenges at different points in that cycle. So we start with farming and growing the crop. Typically, the crop's drilled in autumn. Fields will be rolled, hopefully early spring. And when the grass reaches the right growth stage, it will be cut using mowers. The grass is going to be left on the field where it's spread and turned using a tedder. The amount of time the hay is turned and the length of time it's left on the field for really depends on the weather conditions and the crop thickness. So typically at the start of a season, it could be on the ground for 3 or 4 days. Nearing the end of the season, that might be 24 or 36 hours. When the hay's reached the correct moisture, so we tend to aim for 35 to 45, it's rowed up using a rake, which puts it in lovely rows ready for the balers to come along and bale it. So horse hage is slightly different to some other haylages out there. We make small bales on the field, which are then taken to our packaging plant and packaged. Other companies will make big bales on the field, which will be wrapped out there in the field. Once the bales are made and packed, they're left to ferment before feeding. Typically, that takes about 6 weeks. The bacteria and yeast, which are naturally present in the grasses, will break down the water-soluble carbohydrates in the grass, producing volatile fatty acids, which will give the characteristic lovely haylage smell. This fermentation will continue until either the sugar or the oxygen or moisture is being used up. And then I think on the next slide, I've just got some pictures of our harvesting process to show you. So you can see the balers in the little picture in the top left. Underneath that, you've got our mowers. To the right of that, you have the rake putting the crop into rows, and above that, the tedder, which spreads and turns the grass to dry it. So there are multiple challenges every year when making any type of forage, but I think haylage and hay are particularly challenging. Firstly, we really need a crystal ball. So we can only harvest the crop that's available to us, which sounds, I know, really, really obvious. But when we're looking at cropping and crop rotations, we'll be working out what we're going to plant the spring the year before the harvest. So we can't do anything quickly. We can't change what's in the ground quickly, because we need to know what we're going to be doing that autumn. So typically we'll base what we think we need on past year's sales, typical yields of a field, but that's quite a tricky thing to base things on, and look at any trends we can see. So if a certain grass type looks more popular, we'll try to plant more of that grass variety. Problem being that this demand can change really, really quickly, depending on weather conditions. So if you've got a dry summer, you'd expect to sell more haylage because grass isn't available in the paddocks. And in wet, cold years, horses are probably going to be stabled more and again eat more haylage. Sometimes we just see a product that's increasing in popularity, which we found with our Timothy haylage over the past few years, and the sales of that keep going up. There seems to be an ever-increasing demand for it. So the most massive challenge that we'll ever face is weather. Weather affects our whole process. We need fields to be dry enough to be able to drill them. We need them to be dry enough, but not too dry, so we can get the rollers over them in the spring. So this is really important because you're going to be pushing down anything on the surface like stones and sticks, and it means they won't end up in, hopefully won't end up in the final product. We need moisture and obviously warm weather for growth and crop yields. And then moving on from that, the weather greatly affects the harvest process. So like Katie, we're also a green crop dryer, so we artificially dry crops. That's really helpful because you have a lot of control. You can dry quite a wet forage if you need to. With haylage, while we have some control over the harvesting and drying process, the biggest factor is the weather in how it all turns out. So what we can control is when we cut the fields, how much of it we cut, the order of harvest, so which fields we're doing in what order. And that will be based on field sizes, crop density, sometimes how wet the field is. Once it's cut, we have to decide when to ted and how many times. Like I say, there's quite a big variation in how long the grass is on the floor. It can be a day, it can be 4 days, depending on the weather. Then we have to obviously choose or decide when we're going to rake and bale the crop. The issue we always have is we can only base what we're doing on what the forecast is saying at that exact time. As we all know, the weather forecasts aren't necessarily the most reliable things, and conditions really quickly change. So if we end up with cloud cover when we didn't have much forecast, grass will be slower drying, it will need more tedding. Higher temperatures or more wind, the crop's going to dry more quickly, and that's when we'll then be starting to really chase it to try to get decent quality at the right moisture level haylage in bags for you. Years like this year, unfortunately, with the drought, it does have a negative effect on yields. I'm going to try to balance this out a little bit. Equally, we've had some really, really wet years where the grass is absolutely in abundance, but it's hard then to find the window of a few days of dry weather to cut it and to get any crop good enough to harvest. So the weather is a challenge whatever happens. There is definitely no perfect year, and as farmers we're constantly complaining about the weather. So we had varying demand year on year, as I mentioned earlier, mainly down to weather. While our yields are down, if we do have a mild winter, I'm really hopeful that we won't feel the effects of shortfalls quite so much. So let's all hope for that. We had really huge sales in September, which we actually think is more down to panic buying and people stocking up. I don't necessarily think the customers were buying it to feed it straight away. Sales this month have come back a bit, which is positive. So hopefully if people were panicking, they're panicking a little bit less now, or they're happy that they've got some forage in their barns ready for the winter. Another challenge we have, which isn't so weather dependent, is just keeping an eye on the crop while it's growing. All of us at Fox do a lot of field walking, trying to spot anything that shouldn't be there. For example, fallen branches, maybe weeds, or worst case scenario, poisonous plants. Depending on what we find, we can either use teams for roguing, so groups of people that go out and pick litter, branches, weeds if need be. We can use herbicides, or worst case scenario, which is the saddest thing to ever have to do on a short forage year, the grass can't be made into horse feed and it would have to go to an AD plant. So I thought I would finish off by just trying to explain what makes a quality haylage, just thinking that a lot of people won't be able to buy necessarily from their normal supplier this year. And even though we think yields are low, we still need to be really careful to make sure the quality of the forage we're feeding is right. Sorry, Katie. Oh yeah, you've done it, brilliant. So if you're looking for something that's consistent, you're going to get more consistency from single species lays, just due to the nature of it. Meadow grasses are going to be a variety of different grasses, and you don't quite know the proportion of each of them in that bale. Whereas single species lays, you are buying what it says on the bag, say for example a ryegrass or a timothy grass. If you're going to be buying from your local feed merchant, small bales, ideally look for someone that's got FEMAS and Beta-Nops logos on the pack. These companies will have had their processes really carefully audited. You know, if they're displaying these logos, that the product is fully traceable, and product testing is mandatory on those. Now, big bale producers or local hay producers probably won't have these accreditations. So if you're buying from them, just take care that their quality processes are up to scratch. Choose an experienced haylage supplier, and one that is used to dealing with the equine market, because they will have in mind what they need to do to get the haylage good enough for your horses to eat. As Katie was saying, check packaging. What we don't want is the bales becoming exposed to oxygen. So don't accept damaged packaging, holes that are taped up, anything like that. Just, I wouldn't bother buying it. The only time it's acceptable to have haylage with a hole in it is if the hole has literally been made upon delivery to you and you can use that bale within 5 days. If you can't, I would probably refuse it, even though forage is low. If you're buying big bales which are wrapped, the wrap should be really tight. If the bale wrap's faded, which you can see by moving a couple of layers across to see if the colour underneath is darker, it's a sign the bales have been sat in the sun probably. It isn't a problem necessarily. It will make the wrap more porous. So depending on how many layers of wrap there are, you might find that haylage isn't quite such good quality. Even tiny holes can make a difference. So even just look for bird pecks. You find that some birds and crows, I think they probably like the insects on the wrapping rather than trying to eat the haylage itself, but they can get quite excited about pecking the bales. So just be really careful to make sure your packaging's intact. The next thing, thinking about wastage in particular, is buy the right size bale. Some big bales of haylage, I mean, I weighed one the other day and it was 340 kilos. That's a significant amount of haylage to get through. You have a limited window to use the haylage. Typically, I'd say five days is how long it lasts. In cold weather, you might get 7, you might get a little bit more than that, but you can't have a bale open for weeks and keep feeding it. So just bear in mind, if you've only got one horse or smaller horses, or they're having haylage mixed in with, for example, straw as their forage, that you might not be able to get through these big bales. And it would seem really sad this year to have to throw anything away. So there are some times where you must get rid of the haylage or not feed it. If your haylage has an animal carcass in it or a lot of soil, please discard it. There is a risk of botulism. These should not be fed to horses or livestock. If a bale's got coloured mould on it, this is not white mould, coloured mould, that is bad, and it should be got rid of. So there's a little picture here So you can see the picture on the right is a sort of greyish, greeny coloured mould. The picture on the left is yeast, which is a perfectly natural byproduct. Sorry, it's not a lot of yeast. Katie's just showing you. Perfectly natural byproduct of the fermentation. So this is always going to be a creamy white colour. If you rub your fingers on it, it smells yeasty, and it will also rub off the stem. Typically, you'll find it on cut edges like that. This is absolutely fine to feed. If you had a bale that had a big patch of yeast on it, if it made you feel happier, pull that off, but the rest of the bale's fine. With mould, it is a bit different. If you've got mould on the bale, I would suggest getting rid of it. If you're unhappy or you're worried, contact your supplier. They'll be so used to looking at these. They'll be so used to looking at bales, they'll probably be able to help you. They might even be able to help you just with a photograph. Alternatively, someone might be able to come and see you. If you look for quality guarantees, again, you might not get them from like your local farmer per se, but from the larger companies, you probably will have a quality guarantee on your haylage. So if there is a problem, they'll then replace the bale or refund you for it, and then you're not out of pocket. And hopefully that will mean you don't want to be tempted to feed something that you shouldn't. On that note, if you do ever call a company to make a complaint or because you're worried, it's really helpful if the product has a batch number on, if you can have that ready to tell whoever you're talking to, because that will mean that they can trace the product back. For example, if you give me a batch number from a horsehage bale, I can tell you what field the haylage was made on, when it was mown, weather conditions over harvest, and when that bale was packaged. So it gives me a lot of information that can hopefully help identify what the problem is, if there is an issue there. As Katie said, in a year with potential forage shortage, it's just please try not to discard bales if it's not totally necessary. This year has been a dry year. Our products have been a tad drier than normal. So this year, all the moisture testing I've done so far has thrown results between 35 and 40% moisture. Some other years that might be more 35 to 45, 40 to 45 if it's a wetter year. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the product. It's still wet enough that it's going to ferment completely, but it might not smell quite so sweet, and sometimes it looks a bit browner. And it will look a bit browner if there's a bit of dead stalks in there. But that being said, beggars can't be choosers, I was about to say. That's not quite the right thing to say, but in a year when forage supplies are low, I think we have to just bear natural variation in mind and the effect the weather might have had on the forage. And I think that's probably me done.
Brilliant, Olivia, thank you. I'll stop sharing and then Kate can share her slides.
Thank you, Olivia and Katie. And I'm gonna. Oh, that one's gone up already. Okay, good. Let me just see if I can get the.
Is that the right one, Kate?
Yeah, I'm just going to see if I can go to my fresh screen because I think that will just be. Hopefully is that one working for you now, Claire? Have you got the share screen rather than the uploaded?
That one?
There we are. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Almost exactly the same, but just slightly different. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to Olivia and Katie for that really interesting. I think it's always so important to remember the basis of fibre and forage in the diet. But we're just going to look quickly now at what we need to finish off that diet and make sure that we're feeding for health and vitality through winter as well. So we're just going to look at what we need to complete that jigsaw of fibre and forage as the base, whether it's forage replacers, hays, haylage, whatever we're using. We're going to start with that base forage and then looking at supplementing the fibre bucket feed or fibre hay net feed to make sure that we're providing everything we need. So what do we need to complete that balanced diet? So micronutrients matter, that Katie touched on earlier, and we do get a lot of variability dependent on where we're growing and what we're growing and how we're preserving it. So micronutrients, as the name suggests, are nutrients that are required in really tiny amounts. However, they can be described as small but mighty. So just because we require them in very small amounts doesn't mean that they're necessarily less important. So as an example, I've used selenium. This is just one of the micronutrients, and as Katie mentioned earlier, it's one we are quite prone to being deficient on in this country. Not necessarily, but a lot of our soil and therefore grazing and forage is selenium deficient. It's an essential trace element. So the recommended daily intake for a typical 500 kilogram horse in light exercise is 1 milligram per day. So what do we really mean when we say 1 milligram? How do we visualize 1 milligram, if you like? Well, a standard teaspoon of something like salt or sugar is 5,000 milligrams. So 5 grams is your standard teaspoon. So your recommended daily intake for that nice big 500 kilogram horse that you're riding in light exercise is 1/5,000th of a teaspoon. It is really tiny, but that doesn't mean it's irrelevant. So without that 1/5,000th of a teaspoon, you're going to find that you have poor muscle performance, reduced fertility and reproductive health, not necessarily relevant for all of our horses, but really important in that breeding category. But certainly the muscle performance is necessary for all leisure horses. And why is that? It's because selenium is part of the horse's antioxidant pathway. So actually muscle and fertility are just two examples. Selenium is part of that antioxidant chain, which is dealing at a cellular level in every cell in the body. Selenium's helping to deal with these free radical toxins when they are produced. So it has a really important role to play, even though it's required in tiny amounts. That's just one example. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I like selenium as an example. So that's what we're trying to do with micronutrients. We're trying to balance the diet. So the micronutrients are things like the essential vitamins A, D, E, and the B complexes. Vitamins A and E are generally well provided in fresh grazing, but much less so in preserved forages and as we get into winter. Vitamin D, typically from sunlight, and again in the shorter days that we're having now, there is research in human health that suggests that pretty much all of us in the UK should be taking supplementary vitamin D over the winter, and particularly those of us who live up north, we should definitely be taking vitamin D. And I think it's a relevant consideration for our horses as well, in terms of those shorter day lengths and less exposure to that sunlight. Although, as our other speakers have mentioned, we did have lots of lovely sunlight in parts of the country this year. Doesn't store, unfortunately. So trace elements, zinc, copper, manganese, selenium, these can all be deficient in our local soils and grazing, and any grazing deficiency goes into forage deficiency. So it's quite useful to know what your deficiencies are and to be aware of those and to know what's happening in your local soil. And then, as we also mentioned earlier, the key amino acids, these are the building blocks of protein. So protein required for all sort of growth and repair in the horse in terms of protein, tendons, ligaments, all those soft tissues. Lysine, methionine are key amino acids, and lysine in particular, as we mentioned earlier, is likely to be a little bit low on that forage diet. So those are really what we need to balance the diet. And then alongside that, typically we look at digestive aids. They're not absolutely necessary, but you will find them in most balancers and most products aimed at balancing the diet because they help us to get everything out of the diet. And particularly in this year when we're thinking about feeding to appetite rather than feeding ad lib, when we're thinking about minimizing wastage and making sure we get everything out of that forage and we maximize that forage potential, then having some pre, pro and postbiotics just help to get everything out of the diet. Probiotics in particular are recognized as helping fiber digestion and helping the horse to get everything out of their forage. So probiotics are the live probiotic yeast. You'll see it written on the label as Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Prebiotics are the pre-runners of that, and postbiotics are the end production of fermentation. And then just mention mycotoxin binder at the end there. Olivia touched on molds, and mycotoxins are actually molds of molds, something we see increasingly in our sort of climate change affected forage, particularly actually more in a wetter year. So hopefully this year might not be such an issue. But if we are looking at using absolutely every type of forage, if we are looking at maximizing what we're using, and as Olivia just touched on, we're having to look at every type of forage, then while we definitely would not advise feeding any mold or mycotoxin known affected forage. These mycotoxins are invisible. You won't know they're there. And actually having something like a bentonite clay as a mycotoxin binder can help to deal with any of those invisible concerns in the forage and feed. And just while we're on those micronutrients, you may have noticed there's one missing from the essential vitamins, that's vitamin C. Did you know that horses don't actually require vitamin C? People have lost, us as humans, many millions of years ago, we lost our genetic ability to manufacture a vitamin C, but horses can. So they're not the same as us. They can manufacture vitamin C from their own intake. So on a daily basis, they don't require it. We do have an increased requirement for vitamin C if you've got a stress condition, horses with increased needs, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is general health, the balancing requirements of the diet, and just might be interesting as to why you don't typically see vitamin C in those vitamin and mineral products. So why might we be deficient? Well, there are certain various reasons, and as we touched on earlier, regional. So soil deficiencies are common in the UK, typically copper, manganese, selenium and zinc. What we've got here is the copper changes across the country. This is just an example map, so it may vary, but what we can see here is where you've got good, the red is a good or even an excess of copper, going down through the yellows and into the blues, and here we can see copper deficiency along the south coast, that M4 corridor up to, I do apologise for anyone watching in Scotland, this map doesn't include Scotland or Northern Ireland. I feel really bad about that, but I couldn't find one that had all of them on. But this is just, I think it does show nicely how it changes across the UK. And so, you know, it's worth being aware of what's happening in your local climate and with your local soils. And if you're not aware, if you don't have your soil analysed or your grazing analysed, well worth thinking about doing that. Maybe get together with some friends, get it analysed, you know, and it's really useful to know that baseline. And I think what's also interesting are changing soil needs. We've talked a little bit about climate change this evening, and increased rainfall and increased flooding events are leaching micronutrients out of our soil. They're also increasing the amount of soil damage. So both of these are impacting on micronutrient availability into the grazing and therefore into the forage. And this is something that's going to increase. Rainfall and flooding, again, very dependent dependent on where you are in the country. I'm up north, and I know much more about rainfall and flooding than I know about drought that my colleagues down in the south. But unfortunately, that is a reality of the UK, and it's likely to be how we're going forward. So know your local area, know what's happening, and be aware that climate change is impacting what we think about grass as Dr. Green, don't we? And it's maybe not quite the Dr. Green that we always thought it was these days. Even in the middle of spring and summer with fresh growing grass, that is going to be more nutritious than hay and haylage, but it's still not going to tick every box because of these soil deficiencies. And then, the annual deficiencies, so this is just touching on what we mentioned there. Nutrient imbalances now are showing 2/3 of UK soils are deficient. So this is data from NRM, which is one of the UK's largest independent agronomic analysis. I knew I'd get my tongue twisted over that. Looking at thousands of soil samples and essentially reported that unfortunately the issue is not getting any better. So their agronomy manager, Sajjad Avan, reported that the fact that imbalances have become the norm is concerning, and that is what agriculture tends to be ahead of equine in terms of their understanding of what the soil and the grazing are giving us. And agriculture are definitely concerned about what we're getting from grazing and soil. And I think we in the equine world need to catch up a little bit and be aware of these issues. So, for example, 40% of soils now have an excess of phosphorus, and that's an issue because soils that are too high in phosphorus reduce availability of other nutrients like zinc and iron. And testing is the only way to get the information required. Many farmers, I think Olivia mentioned that farmers won't necessarily give you the analysis, the macronutrient analysis in terms of energy and such like of their hay and haylage. Certainly a lot of local farmers are not going to know their micronutrient analysis because they're either not testing their soils sufficiently, or they're not testing frequently, or they're not fully committing to making changes based on those results. So we need to be aware that it's just not providing what it used to. So do ask for forage analysis on your forages and essentially assume that there are likely to be some shortfalls and imbalances in most soils and therefore most grass and forage. And then we have the winter shortfalls that we just mentioned earlier, vitamin A and E, particularly vitamin D, and those darker days and rugged horses, and regional soil deficiencies that are passed on to the winter shortfalls. So in terms of balancing, I always recommend choosing one broad spectrum product to balance the diet. We do get some customers who, and often it's the customers who are most invested in their horses' welfare and are trying really hard, and they think, I'm going to get some selenium from here, I'm going to get some vitamin E from here. Honestly, it's much better to take that guesswork out of it and let us as the professionals do that for you. So choose one broad spectrum product to balance the diet. It's safer, simpler and cheaper than trying to do the DIY. Choose a trusted, experienced manufacturer to provide what the diet requires for micronutrients. And as I say, consider a product which includes some gut support, particularly to help that hindgut microbiome stability through winter. And maybe just quite simply, supplements versus balancers, what's the difference? Essentially, there is no difference. Both supplements and balancers are legally complementary feeds, but in terms of our understanding of them, balancers typically include that gut support. Supplements may do or may not. Balancers typically include some protein and amino acids. Supplements, particularly concentrated powdered supplements, they may well include the amino acids. Not all of them do, but some do. Typically, though, just because of their feeding rate, they're going to be relatively low in protein. Balancers are traditionally pelleted, but don't have to be. We're seeing increasingly more powdered balancers, so they don't have to be pelleted, but that's typically how we understand them, whereas supplements may be powder, liquid or pellet. Supplements generally 20 to 100 grams per day, where balancers, the traditional balancer tends to be 100 grams per 100 kilos of body weight, but we are seeing now more concentrated balancers on the market, around about 100 grams per day. So sort of crossing that line between supplements and balancers. But as I mentioned earlier, that really is sort of an invented line anyway. There's no legal difference between a supplement or a balancer. They're complementary feeds. So we'll just have a quick look at a few example diets, very simple, how we can stick to that forage and fibre base first, make sure that it's balanced for micronutrients, provide some gut support, and make sure that it's consistent and reliable for availability, but simple and practical. Because at the end of the day, if we can keep it simple and practical, then we keep our horses happy, and we can keep to it throughout the winter. So firstly, the performance horse winter diet. So we've picked here a thoroughbred 550 kilos, ridden 5 times a week, including some fast work over the winter. They're drag hunting, indoor competing. Spring to autumn, they're looking at eventing and combined training. So here we've got, I've just picked a hay. It could have been a haylage, but I've just picked a hay for this one. As Katie mentioned earlier, high dry matter there. So we've got about 11 kilos as fed. This is the as fed rate, and then a nice fibre based feed in the bucket to provide that base and move away from starchy cereals, and a concentrated balancer. And something as simple as that meets the NRC requirements for energy and protein, balance for micronutrients, and helps support healthy digestion by nourishing that microbiome with the balancer element. Okay, so I say that's a fresh weight. Moving to the leisure horse winter diet. Here I've picked a Connemara Cross 500 kilos, ridden 3 to 4 times a week. In the winter, they're dressage, lunging lessons, regular hacking, very typical of what we would see in the working owner who's struggling to fit their horse in around the shorter days and working and such like. And then spring to autumn, hopefully all riding club activities. And here we've gone with that lower dry matter 65% haylage. So you can see the as fed rate is higher. And it's actually higher than the as fed rate of hay for the performance horse, even though this horse is a leisure horse. And that's because of that dry matter. So just emphasizing the importance of knowing the difference in the dry matter and adjusting the as fed rate, the fresh weight. And then again, we've got a nice fibre feed and concentrated balancer. And finally, our typical good doer. This is a New Forest pony, ridden once to twice a week, 300 kilos. In the winter, mainly hacking and the occasional lesson. Spring to autumn, low-level pony club activities and local showing. And here we've gone for a hay and forage straw blend, 5.5 kilos as fed, low calorie fibre feed, and a concentrated balancer. So hopefully that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how we can keep our forage hopefully consistent, hopefully good quality, make sure that we're still feeding plenty of fibre for that essential gut health. At the end of the day, that's what our horses evolved to eat, so we need to make sure we can keep it going, but balanced and healthy for health and vitality. So I will stop sharing, Claire, and hopefully we've covered quite a few bases there.
Brilliant. We're almost out of time, but I've got a couple of questions. Just on the as fed rate on the dry matter, I'm quite good at maths, but even I'm thinking, oh my God, I have to be a mathematical genius to work this out. If somebody has got, they've got, say, whether it be foxes, haylage, or some form of fibre, who can they go to do the sums for them if they really face it and think, oh my God, am I going to be overfeeding my horse?
I think all of us have feed lines and helplines that would definitely do the maths or do any kind of maths, because sometimes it's even comparing things in supplements, feeding rates versus the level of a mineral or whatever in that product, and cost per days. But yeah, most of the reputable companies will have a good feed line that will help you do that.
And just on the haylage, Olivia, I have done this in the past and felt frightfully guilty. I've had small bale haylage hived away in the barn and then thought, oh, are you safe to feed? last year's or even the year before's haylage, is there a best before date on the small bales, or how careful do you need to be?
As long as the haylage was good quality in the first place, once it's been made and it's fermented, it should be very stable. So there's definitely no problem with using last year's or even the year before, if that's what you have around. Obviously, when you open it, just check it smells nice and it looks okay.
And is there any real difference between big bale and small bale haylage?
Well, mainly the size of the bale, and the process of making it would be the same. Just that would be the big bales will be wrapped on the field, whereas, for example, our smaller bales are conventionals and then bagged straight away. Say quite a few haylage companies will use big bales and then break them down and repack into small bales as well. So even if you're buying a small bale, it's not necessarily started out life as a small bale. It could be a big bale broken down.
Yeah. And just a question, if I've fed some haylage in a hay net and there's some left over, are you safe to either, because I don't know what other people's horses are like, but my horses, if they've eaten something out of a hay net and it drops on the ground, you can almost guarantee they're not interested in eating it. Am I safe to then give it to another horse or chuck it out in the field for them to nibble on?
I'm finding that one quite difficult to answer because I would give it to my sheep, but not everyone has that option.
Do the beta knots and kind of, you obviously in terms of disease, if they're on the same yard and things, you just want to watch that and especially if you're competing under rules and things, because you don't know what, if they've eaten something, dropped something on it and you give it to another horse, that wouldn't necessarily, is a potential for cross-contamination. But if you're not worried about competing under rules and you're not too concerned about diseases and things because they're on the same yard and out together and all of that anyway, then yes. It depends. I know it would depend how old it is, how long it's been left for.
And I think it's a little bit of common sense, isn't it? Depending on where it's fallen, how it looks, and as you say, who you're feeding it to, really.
No, thank you. It's yeah. And this is just another question I had. Do you drill your fields annually, Olivia, or do you crop? Do you use a field once drilled several years and then reseed it?
Yeah, the lay would be in the ground for 2 years. And then it would be part of a crop rotation on a farm that will be growing arable crops as well and lucerne as well. So.
Yeah, I know it's really interesting because I see locally grass being grown and they plough it up and I'm thinking it's looking fine. Why are you doing it? So inexperienced eyes looking. And Katie, if somebody is short of hay and wants to move on to a partial hay replacer, how do they go about it? Do they need to phase it in over a specific time?
Yeah, I think, practically, if you can do a little bit sooner rather than later in the season. So if you are thinking you might well be running a bit tight or going to run out completely, it's far better not to make a sudden change. Any time when you're changing horses' diet is a risk time for colic and things. So I would start with a few handfuls. I mean, effectively, they're all forages and high fibre and low starch. So the risk of it causing a digestive upset is lower than if we were making a sudden change from a cereal-based feed to a fibre or the other way around, for example. So I would typically try and use 1 to 2 kilos of a forage replacer throughout the year and save yourself a couple of kilos of your hay every day and do it that way rather than getting to March, running out and then starting something from there. But yes, if you do run out completely, then obviously trying to, at least in those last few days, do a gradual transition and build up. You typically find that forage replacers are more likely to be more nutritious and have more in them. So again, it's finding that right balance between how much you can feed compared to your grass hay without a good doer, for example, putting on weight, because grass-based sort of forage replacer is likely to be harvested when it's younger and more nutritious. So you've got to then dilute it with other things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And Kate, just to finish up, you talked about deficiency of the land. Are there any, without having it sampled, or if you don't want to, or you don't know where to go to, are there any signs that you can actually look for which may be some flags to say there are deficiencies?
Unfortunately not. You can't, I'm sorry about that, you can't really tell the quality, certainly the micronutrient quality, by looking at the grassland. If it's, if you're seeing a lot of damage to that pasture, then that's likely to indicate that you're going to have more of a problem. But honestly, bright green growing grass might be deficient, and there's no real way of knowing. So it is worth getting together, get a few of you together with your friends and have a few tests done. Remember to test across your lands, so the top of a field will be different to the bottom of a field where it gets a lot of runoff. And remember that a single test, unfortunately, doesn't tell you a great deal. You need to repeat it 2 or 3 times a year at least. But yeah, unfortunately, no, you can't really tell the quality from looking at it.
And I have a feeling that people are going to ask this. Where do you get your soil tested?
So most of Katie may well be and Olivia may well be able to advise, but a lot of the major feed companies and forage producers can do that for you. But equally, there are independent, so DEFRA can do that for you as well, but that's going to be more of a cost than going to a forage producer.
You can use NRM. I think, Kate, you shared their data. You can set up an account if you're going to do samples and do it regularly. You could do it with NRM.
Exactly. Yeah. So there are independent analysis, but equally, if you look around, quite a few of the feed companies provide that as well.
Okay, no, that's been really useful. I've learned a lot. I hope our viewers have learned a lot. I'm really appreciating. I think this year more than any other year, people are perhaps paying much more attention to their forage. And I think, Olivia, some of the points you made about quality were really useful. Katie, the basics are absolutely invaluable. And Kate, yes, the micronutrients, you do sometimes forget that you do need to top up your horse's diet with some of the vitamins that you can take in tablet form, but your horse can't. So all 3 of you, thank you so much. It's been really useful, and look forward to hearing from you all again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, team.